There is no honesty and honor in war, and anyone who claims contrary is lying. War is not a sport or entertainment. People are killed during war. You can't replay a battle or have a rematch. And even if the soldiers brutally avenge their comrades that died in a previous battle, this revenge will not resurrect the dead or make up for the losses. The stakes are too high to fight at half strength. That is why any military conflict has always been, is, and will be surrounded by provocations, cruelty, and deceit. Anybody who does not accept these rules of the war game will likely perish. This is episode 84 of the series about the ATO, the history of the war. In spring of 2014, the Russian Federation annexed Crimea and in the following summer invaded the east of Ukraine. As a result of a number of battles, this offensive was successfully halted, but the war was far from over. Spying and diplomacy, economics, propaganda, and armed combat. These are all the elements of hybrid war, which we are trying to figure out. On February 21, 2016, the overall situation in the anti-terrorist operation zone appeared to be relatively stable. Medium-intensity combat continued along the entire demarcation line in the Donetsk Oblast. On the western outskirts of Donetsk, in addition to sniper fire, the militants briefly used weapons mounted on board of infantry fighting vehicles and mortars. A similar situation was observed at the Hnutove-Talakivka defense line. Instances of 4 mortar shelling were observed there. Law enforcement agencies didn't sit idle either. On this day, a former DPR militant was caught in Konstantinivka. In Zaitseva, a Hungarian citizen that displayed the skills of an artilleryman during interrogation was detained on suspicion of involvement in illegally armed groups. And in the city of Pavlohrad in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, officers of the Security Service of Ukraine detained an employee of a radio station who, after being recruited by Russian intelligence agencies, was blatantly disseminating anti-Ukrainian propaganda on social networks. As a reminder, this relative lull in combat was due to a planned rotation of Russian units that had been going on for a week. But on the night of February 22nd, militants increased their activity quite significantly. This was evident in 44 attacks on Ukrainian positions, more than half of which occurred on the Avdiivka sector. At the same time, the tension was much lower in other hotspots on the front. As such, in Krasnohorivka and Hnutove, there were 2 short mortar attacks during the night. Once again, we note that wherever it was appropriate, Ukrainian troops returned fire, conducted reconnaissance, and also developed various counter-offensive measures. On February 22nd, in the neighborhood of Krasnohorivka, 4 Russian soldiers were killed and 7 more were wounded. On February 23rd, the number of attacks literally doubled. Only in the first half of the day, Ukrainian positions came under attack 84 times. Moreover, weapons prohibited in compliance with the Minsk agreements were used 20 times, and in total more than 160 mines and shells fell on Ukrainian positions. The geography of attacks didn't change. The key points of conflict were Avdiivka, Pisky, Zaitseve, Mayorsk, Pervomaiske, and the positions located north of the Donetsk airport, the Putivka mine and Zenit. It is important to note that despite the explosive activation of terrorist activities, only 2 soldiers of the Ukrainian army were wounded during heavy battles over the course of the day. And here we should remind that February 23rd is the Soviet Army Day. After the collapse of the USSR, in Russia the holiday was renamed, though its essence did not change. And the gross violation of the ceasefire in the form of active and random shooting on Ukrainian positions was some kind of a celebratory fireworks display, partly due to the excessive consumption of alcohol. But war has no days off. On the same day, Several trucks with personnel and ammunition entered Ukraine from the territory of the Russian Federation through the Izvarine border crossing point. 3 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and 3 trucks carrying ammunition entered through Ambrosivka, and 4 vehicles with soldiers passed through Novozovsk. On the same day, a convoy of 8 trucks carrying scrap metal, as well as remains of 2 Russian officers and 5 soldiers, left the zone. In addition to conduct reconnaissance and solve various delicate issues, such as eliminating objectionable field commanders, a special-purpose detachment assembled from the personnel of the Russian Federation's Central Intelligence Directorate and the Federal Security Service arrived to Donetsk. It is important to note here that the threat of persecution by the Russian Special Services forced the terrorists to cooperate with the Ukrainian authorities. After all, within the framework of the Waiting for You at Home program, militants who weren't implicated in war crimes can certainly count on amnesty. On February 23rd, 2 such repentant terrorists were detained at the same time, and in the village of Vodiane they discovered a weapon cache containing a wide range of various grenades, as well as 2 machine guns and a sniper rifle. The next day, the activity of the militants significantly and formally decreased. The number of attacks dropped to 56. However, in fact, all the attacks were well targeted and the situation was seriously aggravated. This forced the Ukrainian military to deliver an adequate response, so it wasn't surprising that this day ended with a simultaneous advance on 3 sections of the front. By February 24th, the militants finally left Shirokine. As a result of several months of systematic struggle for every home, the Ukrainian military literally forced the militants out of the village, thus making it impossible for them to maintain their presence there. While secretly and furtively leaving the village, the terrorists left behind a large amount of Russian-made munitions that they were not able to withdraw. At the same time, the militants planted mines in practically every single surviving residential building. On the same day, the front line shifted eastwards in the center of the ATO zone. Units of the 6th Company in the 2nd Battalion of the 72nd Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in several stages covertly took positions on a soil heap in the immediate vicinity of the occupied Dokuchayevsk. This created preconditions for isolation of the city. It is important to note that such actions did not violate the Minsk agreements in any way, since according to them, the city was allegedly supposed to be kept under the control of the local official authorities. We shall also note that the advance was not in any way by accident. Each of these operations were prepared well in advance, with all the nuances of coordination between units and branches of the military ironed out, reconnaissance of the target area, an outline of the plan of action, as well as the organization of various measures to distract and confuse the enemy. However, there's one caveat. In a hybrid truce, the right of way and the first step is always granted to the enemy. Thus, the next shelling or attack by the terrorists becomes a trigger for launching the planned operation. In this way, on February 24th, near the town of Zaitsevo, after a battle that lasted almost an entire day, the Ukrainian troops managed to drive back the enemy, launch a counterattack and take up the positions previously held by the militants. As a result, a large number of ammunition and several weapons were seized, including guided anti-tank missiles and Shmel flamethrowers that were manufactured in 2000. All these weapons were marked as belonging to the Russian armed forces. This once again proves that the Kremlin is supplying weapons to the Donbas militants. And even if you ignore the presence of people who are in fact Russian soldiers in the ranks of the army of Novorossiya, the Russian Federation is essentially sponsoring terrorists in the war against Ukraine. On February 25th, the ceasefire was observed in the Luhansk Oblast, while in the Donetsk Oblast the situation was exactly the opposite. Trying to regain lost ground, in Zaitsevo the militants actively used mortars. As such, the Ukrainian positions on the Svitlodarsk Bulge and in the suburbs of Donetsk came under heavy artillery fire. In the area of Avdiivka, Marinka and Hranitne, sniper groups were highly active. In addition to that, during attacks on Marinka and Krasnohorivka, the militants carried out a series of fairly powerful artillery strikes, using onboard weapons of infantry fighting vehicles, mortars and grenade launchers. To prevent the clearing of mines in Shirokine, the terrorists carried out a brief mortar attack on the village. Among other things, on February 25th, Officers of the SBU detained a saboteur who planted mines on the railway bridge on the Pavlohrad-Lozova stretch. The attacker used a TM-62 anti-tank mine. The explosion was especially programmed to happen during the passage of the Odessa-Konstantinivka train. On February 26th, terrorists violated the ceasefire regime once in the Luhansk Oblast of Ukraine, near the village of Novotoshkevsk. In that instance, the Ukrainian military quickly suppressed the enemy firing positions. The situation was much more complicated in the Donetsk Oblast. Near the Horlivka agglomeration, constant skirmishes continued and the militants used mortars 3 times, which forced the Ukrainian artillery to apply adequate countermeasures. The situation on Svitlodarsk Bulge was also aggravated, while in the area around the Donetsk airport, low-intensity military operations continued around the clock. Attacks and provocations using small arms and grenade launchers took place in Marinka and near Tukuchayevsk. However, there were no shifts of the front line or any military casualties. And in the Luhansk Oblast, they detained saboteurs, who in May 2014 blew up a bridge connecting the cities of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. On February 27th, militants actively made use of mortars in the area of Krasnohorivka. The shelling, as usual, was performed from the village of Staromikhailivka, making counter-battery fire difficult. Small arms and grenade launchers were used in the areas near Troitske, Mayorsk, Zaitsevo, Avdiivka, Piske and Opetne. In the latter case, the terrorists also fired 2 82mm mortar shells at the Ukrainian positions. Another mortar attack was launched in the neighborhood of the village of Chermalik. A local resident was detained in Slavyansk. On February 28th, terrorists sharply increased activity in the traditionally calm Luhansk sector. In the Popasna district, Ukrainian positions were shelled by mortars 6 times, and in addition to artillery attacks, the militants also made active use of small arms. Despite the peaceful initiatives, mortars and IFV weapons were actively used in the Avdiivka, Pisky, Krasnohorivka and Marinka sectors, as well as in the Hnutova and Talakivka districts. The activity of militant snipers and intelligence was detected. It is noteworthy that, hiding from the eyes of the OSCE observers, the occupiers always started firing with the onset of dusk. The day was not bloodless. A soldier of the 54th Brigade was killed in the sector of the Svitlodarsk Bulge. And near Krasnohorivka there was a battle in which 2 Russian terrorists were killed and 2 others were severely wounded. On February 29th, the last day of the second military winter, a truce was established at the Zaitsevo-Mayorsk line for the first time in many months. However, on the Svitlodarsk Bulge and in the neighborhood of the Donetsk airport, peace was nowhere in sight. A total of 35 instances of shelling took place in the Donetsk sector. The situation saw no significant changes. In an effort to improve their position, the militants attacked wherever it was possible. The forces of the anti-terrorist operation, in turn, repeatedly opened fire and made all attempts to create conditions for a new counterattack. On February 29th, another convoy of military equipment arrived to the occupied territory from Russia through the city of Novoazovsk. There were 6 armored combat vehicles, 4 trucks carrying ammunition, and 2 fuel tankers. Despite the boisterous statements, the Kremlin continued its double play. And while demonstratively calling for peace, Russia was literally heavily supplying the occupied territories with military equipment and armed people. As of early March 2016, the total number of tanks in the so-called Army of Novorossiya was equal to the total number of tanks in the armies of Germany and France combined. All this equipment, often with crews and technical personnel, came from Russia, but the official Kremlin stubbornly denied this fact. In war, there is neither honesty nor honor.